Clara Whitmore pressed the letter against her chest one more time before folding it carefully into her traveling case. The words from James Whitlock still made her heart flutter with hope. A rancher from Nevada, seeking a wife, promising a good life away from the suffocating poverty of Boston's tenements. She'd answered his advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette 3 months ago, never truly believing anything would come of it. But here she was, standing at the train station with everything she owned packed into 2 worn cases. The platform bustled with travelers, steam from the locomotive mixing with the morning fog. Clara adjusted her best dress, a faded blue wool that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. At 23, she was considered nearly past prime marrying age by Boston standards. But Mr. Whitlock hadn't seemed to mind. His letters spoke of needing a strong woman who could handle the isolation of ranch life, who wouldn't faint at the sight of dust or livestock. "All aboard for Points West." The conductor's call sent a shiver through her spine. Clara climbed the steps to the second-class car, finding a seat by the window. As Boston's grimy buildings gave way to countryside, she allowed herself to imagine her new life. James had described his ranch nestled in the Nevada mountains, with cattle grazing on endless acres and clear streams running through the property. It sounded like paradise compared to the cramped boarding house where she'd spent the last 5 years sewing collars for pennies. The journey west proved more arduous than she'd anticipated. By the 3rd day, her back ached from the hard seats, and the food at station stops turned her stomach. Near Kansas City, a violent thunderstorm rocked the train, rain streaming through gaps in the windows. Clara huddled under her thin shawl, watching lightning illuminate the vast prairie. At a stop in Colorado, trouble found her. While purchasing bread at the depot, a rough-looking man with yellowed teeth cornered her near the luggage car. "Pretty thing like you traveling alone." He grabbed for her carpet bag. "Let me help with that." Clara jerked back, but he was stronger. Just as panic seized her throat, a tall figure stepped between them. "The lady doesn't need your help." The stranger's voice was low, dangerous. The would-be thief took one look at the newcomer, a mountain of a man in a worn duster coat, and slunk away. Clara's rescuer tipped his hat and disappeared into the crowd before she could thank him. She noticed he walked with a slight limp, and his eyes held a sadness that seemed permanently etched there. The final leg of the journey took her through Nevada's harsh landscape. The train gave way to a series of stagecoaches, each more uncomfortable than the last. Desert heat alternated with mountain cold. Dust coated everything, her clothes, her hair, even her teeth. Clara began to understand why James had warned her about the challenging conditions. The last stagecoach stopped at a desolate way station as twilight painted the mountains purple. Clara climbed down, legs shaky, expecting to see James Whitlock waiting with a wagon as he'd promised in his final letter. Instead, she found only wind and silence. "This is as far as I go, miss," the driver said, tossing her bags down. "Someone should be along for you." But Clara's protest died as the coach lurched away, leaving her alone with the setting sun. An hour passed. The temperature plummeted. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries raising goosebumps on her arms. Clara pulled her shawl tighter, fighting tears. Had she made a terrible mistake? Had James changed his mind? Then she heard it, the slow clip-clop of hooves. A lone rider emerged from the shadows, tall in the saddle. As he drew closer, Clara recognized the broad shoulders and slight limp. It was the man from the Colorado depot. He dismounted without a word, studying her with dark eyes that seemed to look through her. Up close, she could see the weathered lines on his face, the graying at his temples, though he couldn't be more than 35. His clothes were simple, canvas pants, a flannel shirt, boots that had seen countless miles. "Mr. Whitlock?" Clara ventured, though something felt wrong. This man's presence was nothing like the warm letters she'd received. He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up her bags and secured them to his pack horse with practiced efficiency. When he gestured toward his mount, Clara hesitated. I don't understand. Are you James Whitlock?" Still no response. The man's jaw worked as if he wanted to speak, but no words came. Growing frustrated and frightened, Clara stood her ground. "Sir, I need to know where you're taking me. I'm expected at the Whitlock Ranch." He pulled out a worn piece of paper from his pocket and showed it to her. In fading pencil, someone had written, "Clara Whitmore, Tuesday stage." It was James's handwriting. She recognized it from his letters. Relief flooded through her. This must be a ranch hand sent to collect her. Perhaps James was busy with the cattle, or maybe he was shy about their first meeting. With no other choice, Clara allowed the silent man to help her onto his horse. His hands were gentle but impersonal as he lifted her, careful not to touch more than necessary. He swung up behind her, reaching around to take the reins. She could smell leather and wood smoke on him, feel the solid wall of his chest at her back. They rode through darkness, following paths she couldn't see. The mountains loomed like sleeping giants. Wind whipped through the canyons, carrying the scent of sage and something wild. Clara had never felt so far from civilization. After what seemed like hours, yellow lamplight appeared ahead. A log cabin materialized from the darkness, smaller and rougher than she'd imagined. With a sagging porch and gaps in the chinking, this wasn't the prosperous ranch from James's letters. The man dismounted and helped her down. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. Basic furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner. No woman's touch anywhere. Clara turned to face her silent escort, unease creeping up her spine. "Where's Mr. Whitlock? James Whitlock?" The man's face tightened with something like pain. He moved to a shelf and pulled down a slate board, writing with chalk in careful letters. "Elias Gray." "Elias Gray?" Clara repeated. "But I'm supposed to marry James Whitlock. There's been a mistake." He shook his head slowly, then wrote again. "No mistake. I don't understand." Tears threatened now, exhaustion and fear overwhelming her. "Please, where is James?" Elias, for that's who he was, stared at her for a long moment. She saw a war play out behind his eyes, as if he were wrestling with some terrible decision. Finally, he set down the slate and moved to stoke the fire, his back to her. The message was clear. No more questions tonight. Clara sank into one of the chairs, her traveling dress dusty and wrinkled, her dreams of a loving husband welcoming her home crumbling like desert sand. Outside, wolves howled, much closer than before. The wind rattled the windows, and the silent man named Elias Gray moved about the cabin like a ghost, preparing a simple meal of beans and biscuit, pouring water from a pitcher for her to wash. As she lay on the narrow bed that night, Elias had gestured for her to take it while he bedded down by the fire. Clara stared at the rough ceiling beams and wondered what she'd gotten herself into. This wasn't the James from the letters. She was certain. But why had he shown her James's handwriting? Why had he brought her here? The fire burned low. Elias's breathing deepened into sleep, and Clara Whitmore, who'd traveled 3,000 miles to marry a stranger, found herself in a stranger situation than she'd ever imagined. Tomorrow she would demand answers. Tonight, she could only pull the thin blanket higher and pray that morning would bring clarity to this desolate place where words seemed as scarce as water. In the dying firelight, she caught a glimpse of Elias's face in repose. The harsh lines had softened, and she saw something there, a deep sadness. Yes, but also a gentleness that his waking self kept carefully hidden. Whatever mystery surrounded James Whitlock and Elias Gray, Clara sensed her life had taken a turn she never could have anticipated. The promising letters, the dreams of love and prosperity, all of it felt as distant now as Boston itself. She was alone in the wilderness with a man who wouldn't or couldn't speak, in a cabin that groaned with secrets. As sleep finally claimed her, the last thing she heard was the mournful wind singing through the canyon, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of hard truths to come. The first week passed in a strange dance of silence and gestures. Clara tried everything, speaking slowly and clearly, writing questions on the slate, even attempting simple hand signals. But Elias responded only with the bare minimum, pointing to things she needed or shaking his head when she ventured too close to topics he wouldn't address. She learned his routines by observation. He rose before dawn to tend the horses, returned for a silent breakfast of coffee and biscuit, then disappeared into the mountains until dusk. Sometimes he brought back game, a rabbit or wild turkey. Other times he returned empty-handed but with firewood strapped to the pack horse. Clara found herself talking to fill the silence, narrating her actions as she swept the floor or mended a tear in her dress. Back in Boston, my landlady, Mrs. O'Brien, would say a quiet house invited the devil in. She'd sing all day long, Irish ballads mostly, terribly off-key. She glanced at Elias, who was repairing a bridle by the fire. I suppose you think I talk too much. He looked up then, and she caught something in his eyes, not annoyance, but a kind of careful attention, as if he were storing her words somewhere safe. The cabin, she discovered, was better supplied than its rough exterior suggested. The root cellar held preserves, smoked meat, sacks of flour and beans. There were books on a high shelf, Shakespeare, the Bible, even a collection of poetry with margin notes in a feminine hand. When she reached for them, Elias gently stopped her, shaking his head. On the 8th night, the weather turned vicious. Hail hammered the roof like gunfire. Wind shrieked through the canyon, finding every gap in the cabin walls. Clara had been feeling poorly all day, a headache building behind her eyes. As the temperature plummeted, she began to shiver uncontrollably. She tried to hide it, wrapping herself in the thin blanket, but her teeth chattered audibly. Elias noticed. He noticed everything. She'd learned. He rose from his chair and approached slowly, the way one might approach a spooked horse, when he placed his palm on her forehead. His eyes widened in alarm. The fever had come on fast and fierce. Clara's world narrowed to alternating waves of burning heat and freezing cold. She was vaguely aware of Elias moving about, stoking the fire higher, piling every blanket in the cabin onto her shaking form. Through her delirium, she felt him lift her from the bed. The world tilted sickeningly. Cold air bit at her face. They were outside. She tried to protest, but her voice came out as a weak moan. Elias held her against his chest as he mounted his horse, wrapping his coat around them both. The ride was a nightmare of jostling movement and howling wind. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of Elias's arms keeping her from falling, his voice making soothing sounds that weren't quite words. Once, when she surfaced from the fever dreams, she found herself looking up at his face. Ice crystals clung to his beard. His jaw was set with determination, eyes fixed on some point in the darkness ahead. Light finally appeared, not the cabin, but a small settlement she hadn't known existed. Elias carried her into a building that smelled of carbolic and herbs. A woman's voice, sharp with authority. "Good Lord, Elias, what have you done to this poor girl?" "He saved me," Clara tried to say, but the words tangled on her tongue. For 3 days, she fought the fever under the care of Dr. Martha Holloway, one of the few female physicians in Nevada Territory. Elias never left. He slept in a chair beside her bed, jumping up whenever she stirred. When the delirium made her cry out for her mother, dead these 5 years, he held her hand carefully, as if it might break. When the fever finally broke, Clara woke to find him asleep in that uncomfortable chair, his large frame folded awkwardly. His face was haggard, dark circles under his eyes. How many nights had he kept vigil? "He hasn't left once." "Doctor," Holloway said, checking Clara's temperature. "Wouldn't even go home to feed his stock. I had to send my boy Tommy to tend them." She studied Clara shrewdly. "You know he can't speak, don't you? Hasn't said a word in near 15 years. Not since, well, that's his story to tell, if he ever finds a way." Clara looked at Elias sleeping and felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't the husband she'd dreamed of during those long nights in Boston, but he'd ridden through a blizzard to save her life, stayed by her side through the worst of it. The journey back to the cabin was different. Elias had borrowed a small wagon, making a nest of blankets for her in the back. He drove slowly, avoiding the worst ruts. When they stopped to rest the horses, he helped her down carefully, spreading a blanket on a sunny rock where she could sit while he watered the animals. "Thank you," Clara said simply. For everything. He ducked his head, almost shy, then surprised her by pulling out his chalk and slate. You would have done the same. It was the longest sentence he'd written for her. Back at the cabin, their dynamic had changed. Clara was too weak to do much beyond simple tasks, but she insisted on helping where she could. She discovered Elias was an excellent cook when he put his mind to it. His venison stew with wild herbs was better than anything she'd eaten in Boston. He'd also proven unexpectedly gentle, helping her walk when her legs were shaky, ensuring she ate enough to regain her strength. One evening, as she sat by the fire mending one of his shirts, the man was death on clothing. She began humming. It was an old hymn her mother used to sing. She'd almost forgotten it when she noticed Elias had gone completely still, his whittling knife suspended over the piece of wood he'd been shaping. Do you know it? She asked softly. He nodded slowly, his eyes distant. Then he resumed whittling, but his movements had changed, keeping time with her humming. As the days passed and Clara grew stronger, she threw herself into improving the cabin. The place had been neglected. That was clear. She attacked the accumulated grime with vengeance, scrubbing until the floorboards showed their original golden color. She patched the gaps in the walls with rags and mud, the way she'd seen other frontier women do in the towns they'd passed through. The garden was her special project. Behind the cabin, she found evidence of an old plot, now overrun with weeds. Someone grew vegetables here once, she told Elias, who watched from the porch as she pulled weeds with determined fury. The soil's still good. Come spring, we could have tomatoes, beans, maybe some corn. He brought her seeds the next time he went to town, packets wrapped in brown paper with careful labels. He'd also brought fabric, sturdy calico that would make good curtains. Clara hadn't asked for it, but he'd noticed her eyeing the bare windows. One morning, she found him building something behind the woodshed. A chicken coop. She realized. Fresh eggs would be nice, she said, trying not to show how touched she was. He almost smiled. She was getting better at reading his expressions. The day she was hanging the new curtains, standing on a chair that wobbled dangerously, Elias was suddenly there, steadying it with his hands. She looked down at him, at this man who spoke in actions rather than words, and felt that strange shift in her chest again. I'm not going anywhere. You know, she said quietly. I don't know why you brought me here instead of to James, but I'm not leaving. His hands tightened on the chair. For a moment, she thought he might finally explain everything. Instead, he helped her down carefully and went back outside, but not before she caught the look in his eyes. Surprise, hope, and something else that made her heart beat faster. That night, as had become their custom, they sat by the fire, him whittling, her sewing. The silence between them was no longer empty, but full of small comforts. The crack of the fire, the whistle of wind outside, the soft scrape of knife on wood. Clara found herself stealing glances at him, noting the way firelight caught in his dark hair, the careful precision of his large hands. She was beginning to understand that Elias Gray spoke in a language all his own, the fresh game that appeared when her strength flagged, the wildflowers on the table when she mentioned missing colors, the way he always checked the windows and door before bed, making sure she felt safe. In Boston, she said into the comfortable quiet, I thought love would come with grand declarations and passionate letters. I never imagined it might sound like silence. Elias's knife stilled. He looked at her across the fire, and in his eyes she saw a question he couldn't ask, and she wasn't ready to answer. Not yet. But as she lay in bed that night, he still insisted on taking the floor. Despite her protests, Clara thought about the way home was beginning to mean not a place, but a person. A silent guardian who'd carried her through a storm and stayed by her side through the fever that followed. Whatever mystery surrounded James Whitlock, whatever reason Elias had for bringing her here, Clara was starting to believe she was exactly where she belonged, in a cabin that was becoming a home, with a man whose silence said more than most men's words ever could. The discovery came on a rain-soaked afternoon when Clara was cleaning out an old trunk in the corner of the cabin. She'd been organizing, trying to make more room for her few belongings, when her fingers brushed against something wrapped in oilcloth at the very bottom. It was a photograph, edges yellowed with age. Two men stood before a newly built barn, arms crossed, trying to look serious for the camera but with hints of smiles playing at their mouths. One was unmistakably Elias, younger, cleaner shaven, with eyes that hadn't yet learned to guard themselves. The other, Clara's hands began to shake. The other man could have been Elias's twin, though he was slightly shorter, his build leaner. But it was the neat script on the back that made her blood run cold. Elias and James Whitlock, spring 1884. James Whitlock, her intended husband, standing right beside Elias. The photograph slipped from her numb fingers. All the questions she'd pushed aside came rushing back. Why had Elias met her at the stage? Where was James? What web of deception had she stumbled into? When Elias returned from checking his trap lines, Clara was waiting by the door, the photograph clutched in her hand. Rain dripped from his hat brim as he took in her stance. Her face, his expression shifted from confusion to recognition to something that looked terribly like shame. "Explain," she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening. "Now." He set down his rifle slowly, water pooling around his boots. For a long moment, they stood frozen, the rain drumming on the roof, the only sound. Then Elias moved to the table, pulled out his slate, and began to write. But Clara was past patience. "No!" She slammed the photograph on the table. "No more half answers. Where is James Whitlock? Why did you bring me here?" Elias's jaw worked, that familiar struggle she'd seen so many times. His hands clenched and unclenched. Finally, he picked up the chalk with shaking fingers and wrote, "I couldn't let you stand there alone." "That's not an answer," Clara's composure cracked. "I traveled 3,000 miles to marry a man who wrote me beautiful letters, who promised me a life, a future. Was it all a lie? Did you and James plan this together? Am I some kind of joke to you?" The pain that flashed across Elias's face was so raw that Clara stepped back. He shook his head violently, then wrote in quick, agitated strokes. "No joke, never a joke." "Then where is he?" Elias stared at the slate for a long moment. Then, instead of writing, he moved to the door, gesturing for her to follow. Clara grabbed her shawl, her anger making her reckless. If he thought he could avoid this conversation by walking away. But he wasn't running. He was leading her up a narrow path she'd never noticed before, winding through pine trees heavy with rain. The path was treacherous with mud, and once when Clara slipped, Elias caught her arm, steadying her with infinite care despite the turmoil in his eyes. They emerged in a small clearing. At its center stood a wooden cross, weathered but sturdy. The name carved into it was clear even through the rain. James Matthew Whitlock, 1859 to 1889. Clara's knees buckled. James was dead. Had been dead for, she counted back, 3 months, right around the time his letters had stopped coming, when she'd already been making plans to travel west. She sank to the wet ground, heedless of the mud soaking her skirt. "When?" she whispered. Elias knelt beside her, writing in the mud with his finger. "March, lung fever." But the letters. He was writing to me in February about spring planting, about building a new room for a wife, for her. Elias's shoulders bowed as if under a great weight. He smoothed the mud and wrote again. "He was very sick, made plans anyway, said you gave him hope." Clara pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed. All those dreams, those carefully laid plans, built by a dying man who'd refused to give up hope. "And you're not a Whitlock." He shook his head, then wrote, "Gray, mother's name, half-brothers." The pieces were falling into place. "You couldn't write to tell me, couldn't send word that he died?" His face crumpled with anguish. He pointed to his throat, then shook his head. "Of course, he couldn't speak, couldn't write well enough for a letter. By the time he could have found someone to write for him, she would already have been on her way. So you met me instead." Clara's anger was fading, replaced by a deep sadness. You couldn't bear to let me arrive to nothing." Elias nodded slowly. Then, with trembling fingers, he wrote in the mud, "Saw you standing there, brave, alone. Couldn't leave you." Clara looked at this man kneeling in the mud beside her, rain streaming down his face. For weeks, he'd sheltered her, cared for her, let her rail against him for answers he couldn't easily give. He'd saved her life in that blizzard, stayed by her side through the fever, all while bearing the weight of this terrible truth. "Oh, Elias," she breathed. "You should have found a way to tell me." He spread his hands helplessly, and she saw the full tragedy of it. A man who couldn't speak, trying to explain why he'd done something that had no good explanation. He'd acted on impulse, on compassion, and then been trapped by his own silence. They knelt there in the rain, by the grave of the man she'd thought she'd marry, while the living man beside her shivered in his wet clothes. Clara found herself studying Elias with new eyes. Not James's betrayer, but his brother, grieving too. "Tell me about him," she said softly. "James, what was he really like?" Elias's face gentled. He stood, offering her his hand, and led her back to the cabin. While she changed into dry clothes, he built up the fire and made coffee. Then, laboriously, he began to write. The story came in fragments, limited by his painstaking script. James had been the talker, the dreamer, 3 years younger than Elias, always full of plans. He'd read about mail-order brides in a newspaper and decided it was the answer to his loneliness. "She'll be perfect," he'd told Elias. "I can feel it in her letters. She's strong and kind and funny." When the lung fever took hold, James had fought it with everything he had. He'd been so certain he'd recover by the time Clara arrived. Even at the end, he was making plans, telling Elias where to plant the garden, how to fix up the cabin. "Did he ask you to meet me?" Clara asked. Elias shook his head. "Saw the letter. Date. Couldn't let you be alone." As the evening wore on, more truths emerged. The cabin was Elias's. James had lived in town, working at the general store to save money for his own place. The books with feminine handwriting had belonged to their mother. The careful improvements Elias had been making were things James had talked about doing for his bride. But the deepest truth came last, written with a shaking hand. "Father killed mother. I saw, tried to scream. Nothing came, never spoke again." Clara gasped, understanding flooding through her. The trauma that had stolen his voice, the reason he lived alone in the mountains, the sadness that never quite left his eyes. Without thinking, she reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers were rough with calluses, but they trembled in her grasp. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "For everything you've lost, for everything you've carried alone." Elias looked at their joined hands as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. Then, carefully, he turned his palm up to lace their fingers together. They sat like that as the fire burned low. Two people brought together by loss and lies and the strange mercy of a man who couldn't bear to see a woman stand alone at a stage depot. "What happens now?" Clara finally asked. "I can't marry a dead man. I have no claim to be here. Do you want me to leave?" Elias's grip tightened almost painfully. He shook his head, then wrote with his free hand, "Please stay." "As what?" Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "Your housekeeper? Your burden?" He released her hand to write more clearly. "As Clara. Just Clara. That's enough." She looked at him, this complex, broken, beautiful man who'd shown her more kindness in silence than most men could manage with 1,000 words. She thought of the life she'd built here in these few short weeks, the home they'd begun to make together without even realizing it. "All right," she said softly. "I'll stay. For now. As Clara." Relief transformed Elias's face, making him look years younger. He stood abruptly, as if afraid she might change her mind, and busied himself banking the fire for the night. But before he settled onto his makeshift bed on the floor, he did something that stopped Clara's heart. He spoke just one word, rusty and painful, as if dragged from some deep place he'd locked away. "Good." Clara lay awake long into the night, listening to the rain on the roof and Elias's breathing by the dying fire. Everything had changed, and nothing had. She was still a woman far from home with an uncertain future, but now she understood the shape of the silence that surrounded her, the weight of the secrets this cabin held, and somewhere beneath the sorrow for the man she'd never meet and the confusion about the man she was coming to know, a different feeling was taking root. Not the love she'd expected to find with James Whitlock, but something else, deeper, quieter, built on shared silence and steady care. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be questions of propriety, of futures, of hearts that were learning to speak without words. But tonight, Clara pulled the quilt higher and let herself find comfort in the sound of Elias's breathing, in the knowledge that neither of them was alone anymore in this vast, wild place where even silence could say, "Please stay." The days after the revelation at James's grave settled into a new rhythm. They moved around each other with careful awareness, like dancers learning new steps. Clara still cooked and mended and tended her growing garden. Elias still hunted and chopped wood and repaired what needed fixing. But now there was something else in the space between them, an acknowledgement of what they were building together, even if neither could name it. The small intimacies accumulated like spring snow. The way Elias's hand would brush hers when passing a dish. How Clara would smooth his collar before he left for town, her fingers lingering just a moment too long. The evening she found him struggling to darn a sock and laughed, not at him, but with gentle affection, before taking it from his hands and showing him the proper way. "You're hopeless with needle and thread," she said, smiling. "But I suppose I can't split wood worth a damn. So we're even." He almost smiled back. She was getting better at coaxing those from him. One evening, as she brushed her hair by the fire, she caught him watching, not with improper interest, but with something wondering in his eyes. "What is it?" she asked softly. He wrote on his slate. "Mother used to do that, 100 strokes each night. Would you—" Clara hesitated, then held out the brush. "Would you like to?" His eyes widened. It was too intimate. She knew, too far beyond what was proper between them. But proper had fled the moment she'd chosen to stay in this cabin with a man who wasn't her husband, might never be. Elias took the brush with reverent hands. He stood behind her chair, and after a moment's hesitation, began to pull it through her long brown hair. His touch was feather-light, as if he were handling spun glass. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the gentle tugs, the warmth of his presence behind her. Neither of them spoke of it the next day, but something had shifted again. The thunder came 3 nights later, rolling through the canyon like God's own fury. Clara had never liked storms, too many memories of huddling in drafty tenements while rain found every crack. She lay rigid in bed, trying not to flinch at each crash. A particularly violent crack of lightning illuminated the cabin, followed immediately by thunder that shook the walls. Clara couldn't suppress a whimper. Within seconds, she heard Elias rise from his place by the fire. He stood by her bedside, concern written on his face in the flickering firelight. He held up his slate. "Afraid?" "I'm being silly," Clara said, though her voice shook. "It's just noise." Another crash. She pulled the quilt over her head, embarrassed by her fear. The bed dipped as Elias sat on its edge. The first time he'd come so close to where she slept. Gently. He pulled the quilt down to see her face. His hand hovered near her cheek, a question in the gesture. When she didn't pull away, he touched her face softly, thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Then, to her amazement, she heard his voice again. Rough, barely used, but real. "Don't be scared." The effort those 3 words cost him was clear. Clara reached up and covered his hand with hers, pressing it against her cheek. "Stay," she whispered. "Please, just until the storm passes." He shouldn't. They both knew it. But Elias moved to sit with his back against the headboard, on top of the quilts, fully dressed. Clara curled on her side facing him, their hands still linked between them. When the thunder crashed again, His thumb stroked over her knuckles, steady and reassuring. Sometime in the night, Clara woke to find they'd shifted. Elias had slid down, his head on the pillow beside hers. She was curved against his chest, his arm around her waist, holding her as if she were precious and fragile and his all at once. She should move away. Instead, she pressed closer, feeling his heartbeat against her back, and let herself pretend for just these storm-dark hours that this was where she belonged. When dawn came, Elias was gone, the space beside her cool. She found him splitting wood with unusual vigor, not meeting her eyes. The careful distance was back, and Clara felt the loss of his warmth like a physical ache. Days passed. They danced their careful dance. But now Clara was achingly aware of every movement, every glance. When Elias handed her something, she made sure their fingers touched. When he came in from the cold, she stood close as she helped him with his coat, breathing in his scent of pine and leather. One night, she pushed too far. Elias was teaching her to play checkers, James's board, he'd written, kept for memory's sake. Clara was losing badly and laughing about it when she reached across to move a piece and deliberately knocked over his king. "Clara Whitmore, you cheat!" she declared in mock indignation at herself. "What do you have to say for yourself?" "Pretty," Elias said. The word hung in the air between them. Clara froze, her hand still extended over the board. Elias's face flushed deep red. He grabbed for his slate, writing frantically, "The move, pretty move, strategy." But they both knew that wasn't what he'd meant. The word had escaped from wherever he kept all the others locked away, honest and raw. Clara stood abruptly, knocking over several pieces. I'm tired. Good night, Elias." She fled to her corner of the cabin, pulling the curtain he'd hung to give her privacy. Behind it, she pressed her hands to her burning cheeks. Pretty. He thought she was pretty. The word echoed in his broken voice, making her shiver. She heard him bank the fire, heard his footsteps pause by her curtain. Clara, just her name, difficult but clear. "Good night," she whispered again, and after a moment, his footsteps moved away. Neither slept well that night. The next morning brought a new torture. Elias seemed determined to maintain even more distance between them. He left early and stayed away until well after dark. When he was home, he avoided her eyes, kept to monosyllables on his slate. Clara felt his withdrawal like a wound. On the third day of this treatment, she'd had enough. When he tried to slip past her after dinner, she planted herself in his path. "Stop it." He raised an eyebrow, trying for innocence. "You know what you're doing. You said something honest, and now you're punishing us both for it." Clara's hands clenched in her skirts. "Do you want me to leave? Is that what this is about?" His reaction was immediate and visceral. The slate clattered from his hands as he reached for her, gripping her shoulders. "No," he managed, the word torn from him. "No, leave." "Then stop running from me," Clara said, tears starting. "I can't bear it when you go cold like this. I know what we are is unconventional. I know I'm not what you expected when you brought me here, but I thought we were building something." Elias's hands gentled on her shoulders, sliding down to her arms. He looked at her with such longing that her breath caught. One hand rose to her face, fingers trembling as they traced her cheek, her jaw, hovering at her lips. "Elias," she breathed. He made a sound, frustration, desire, defeat all mingled. His hand dropped. He stepped back, then grabbed his slate and wrote, "Can't give you words. Can't give you what James would have." "I don't want what James would have given me," Clara said fiercely. "I want—" But what did she want? This man who spoke in touches and looks and careful attention. This cabin that was becoming home. This life that was nothing like she'd imagined, but was becoming everything she needed. "You," she whispered. "I want you." Elias closed his eyes as if she'd struck him. When he opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. He wrote slowly, "I dream about you. Wake up reaching for you. Work all day thinking of you. Come home to you. Not fair to you. Why isn't it fair? Because I can't—" He gestured helplessly at his throat. "Can't what?" Tell me you care for me. You do that every day, every meal you hunt for us, every flower you leave on the table, every time you look at me like you're looking now." Clara stepped closer, close enough to feel his warmth. "I don't need words. Elias, I just need you." He made that sound again, and this time Clara recognized it as her name trying to form in his damaged throat. She rose on her toes, bringing her face close to his. "Show me," she whispered against his lips. "If you can't say it, show me." For a heartbeat, he held perfectly still. Then his control shattered. His arms came around her, crushing her against him as his mouth found hers. The kiss was desperate. Years of loneliness and want poured into the connection. Clara gasped, and he swallowed the sound, one hand tangling in her hair, the other pressed against her back as if he could merge them into one being. When they finally broke apart, both were shaking. Elias's eyes were wild, uncertain. Clara touched his face gently. "See, no words needed." He let out a breath that might have been a laugh or a sob. Then he was kissing her again. Softer this time. Reverent, an exploration rather than a claiming. Clara melted into him, feeling the careful strength in his arms, the thundering of his heart against hers. When he pulled back this time, he rested his forehead against hers. They stood there breathing together, adjusting to this new territory they'd crossed into. Finally. Elias stepped back, but kept hold of her hand. He led her to the fire, sitting in his usual chair and pulling her onto his lap. Another boundary crossed, another rule broken. Clara curled against his chest, feeling the rumble of his breathing. His hand stroked her hair, down her back, learning the shape of her. She pressed a kiss to his throat, feeling him swallow hard. They sat like that as the fire burned low, touching and holding and marveling at the permission to do so. No words were needed as hands spoke of growing love, as kisses promised tomorrows, as two lonely souls finally found their home in each other. When Elias finally, reluctantly, set her on her feet to bank the fire for the night, Clara caught his hand. "No more sleeping on the floor," she said softly. "Please." His eyes widened. She blushed but held his gaze. "Just to hold me, like in the storm. That's all I'm asking for now." He nodded slowly. And when Clara lay down in her narrow bed, Elias lay beside her, gathering her close with infinite care. She fitted against him perfectly, as if they'd been carved from the same tree, split apart and finally reunited. "Pretty," he whispered into her hair, and Clara smiled against his chest. "Yours," she whispered back, and felt him tremble. Outside, coyotes called to the rising moon. Wind sang through the canyon walls, and in a cabin that had seen too much sorrow, two hearts began to heal, speaking in the language they were learning together, one made of touch and trust and the precious few words that mattered most. The peddler arrived on a dusty afternoon in late May, his wagon rattling with pots and fabrics and news from the outside world. Clara was tending her garden when she heard the bells, a sound so unexpected in their isolated valley that she nearly dropped her watering can. "Afternoon, ma'am," the peddler called, tipping his weathered hat. He was a round man with merry eyes, the kind who collected gossip like others collected coins. "Name's Chester Willoughby. Don't suppose you'd be interested in some fine goods from Sacramento?" Clara wiped her hands on her apron, glancing toward the ridge where Elias had gone to check his trap lines. Perhaps you'd like some water first, Mr. Willoughby? It's a hot day for traveling." As she drew water from the well, Chester's eyes roamed over the tidy cabin, the flourishing garden, the evidence of a life being lived. "Been out this way before," he said conversationally. "Used to stop by when the Whitlock boys lived here. Shame about young James. Lung fever, wasn't it?" Clara's hand stilled on the ladle. "You knew James?" "Oh, sure. Bright young fellow. Heard tell he sent for a mail-order bride before he passed." Chester's eyes sharpened with curiosity. "Some say the girl went missing. Never made it to town. Family back east is supposedly looking for her." The ground seemed to shift under Clara's feet. Family looking for her? She had no family. had made that clear in her letters to James. This had to be something else. Authorities, perhaps. Concerned about a woman's disappearance. How terrible, she managed. I hope she's found safe. Chester leaned closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Between you and me, ma'am, I think she probably found herself a better situation. Rough country out here for a woman alone. If she's smart, she's keeping quiet wherever she landed. He winked. Now, can I interest you in some ribbon? Got a pretty blue that would match your eyes? Clara purchased a few small items with trembling hands. Thread, a packet of needles, some peppermint sticks. Elias had a weakness for. As Chester prepared to leave, he paused. You know, you remind me of someone. Can't quite place it. You been in these parts long? My husband and I keep to ourselves. Clara said carefully, Husband, eh? Chester's gaze went to her bare left hand. Well, good day to you then, Mrs. Gray, Clara said firmly. Mrs. Gray. After the peddler's wagon disappeared in a cloud of dust, Clara sank onto the porch steps, her heart hammered against her ribs. People were looking for her. Questions were being asked. How long before someone put the pieces together? When Elias returned at dusk, he found her still on the porch, knees drawn to her chest. He dropped his rabbit catches and crossed to her in quick strides, kneeling before her with concern etched on his face. There was a peddler, Clara said dully. Chester Willoughby. He said people are looking for James's missing bride. Said her family back east wants her found. Elias's face darkened. He pulled out his ever-present slate. You have no family. I know, which means it's something else. Maybe the marriage broker, or authorities, or... Clara's voice broke. What if they come here? What if they take me away? Elias made a sound low in his throat. Pain and anger mixed. He set aside the slate and cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. What she saw there stole her breath. Fierce protectiveness, determination, and something deeper that made her chest tight. No, he said clearly. The word hard-won but firm. Not, take, you can't stop them if they come with the law. Clara whispered. I'm not your wife. I'm not anything in the eyes of the law. Just a missing woman living in sin with a man who isn't her husband. Elias flinched as if she'd slapped him. He stood abruptly and strode into the cabin. Clara heard him rummaging, heard a drawer slam. When he emerged, he held paper and his best pen, items she'd only seen him use once, to sign a deed at the land office. He sat at the rough outdoor table and began to write. It was painful to watch, each letter carefully formed, his hand cramping with the effort. Clara read over his shoulder as the words took shape. To who needs to know? Clara Whitmore came to marry my brother James. James died before. I met her at stage. Could not leave her alone. She stays with me now. My choice. Her choice. No force, no harm. She is good woman. Leave her be. Elias Gray. Elias, what are you doing? He looked up at her, sweat beading his forehead from the effort of writing. His free hand found hers. Send, town, sheriff, judge, tell, truth. No! Clara snatched the paper. You can't do this. They'll arrest you for kidnapping or coercion or God knows what. They won't understand. He gently took the paper back and continued writing. She is free to go, always free. I never stop her. Ask her yourself. Clara read the words through tears. This beautiful, broken man was willing to risk everything. His freedom, his home, his life, to protect her reputation, to make sure everyone knew she'd chosen to stay. There has to be another way, she said desperately. But even as she spoke, she knew there wasn't. Not unless... The thought came unbidden, dangerous in its simplicity. They couldn't question a wife about choosing to stay with her husband. Marriage was sacred, unassailable by gossip or suspicion. Elias, she said slowly, what if I wasn't a missing woman? What if I was your wife? He went very still, the pen dropping from his fingers. His eyes searched hers. hope and disbelief warring in their depths. "I know it's not. We haven't—" Clara felt her cheeks burn. "But Chester assumed I was Mrs. Gray. Others would too, if we married, quietly. No one could force me to leave. No one could take me from you." Elias stood so abruptly, his chair toppled. He paced to the edge of the porch, hands clenched at his sides. Clara watched his shoulders rise and fall with rapid breaths. When he turned back, his face was anguished. He grabbed the slate, writing with quick, sharp strokes. "Not trap you here, not force you. You deserve better than silent man, better than lies and hiding." Clara rose and went to him, taking the slate from his hands. "I'm not trapped. I've never been trapped. Every day I stay is a choice." She touched his chest, feeling his heart race under her palm. "I choose you. Elias, I choose this life we're building. Let me keep choosing it." He caught her hand, pressing it harder against his heart. His mouth opened, closed, the eternal struggle to form words playing across his face. Finally, "Love, you." 2 words, 2 impossible, precious words that cost him everything to speak. Clara's vision blurred. "I love you too. So much it frightens me sometimes." He kissed her then, fierce and desperate, backing her against the porch post. His hands framed her face, thumbs wiping away her tears even as his own eyes grew wet. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, breathing hard. "Marry?" he whispered, the question barely audible. "Yes," Clara whispered back. "Yes, if you'll have me." His laugh was soundless but real, his first she'd ever witnessed. He spun her around, lifting her off her feet, burying his face in her neck. She felt him trembling, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were choosing. When he set her down, he immediately began planning, grabbing a slate to write. "Town, tomorrow. Judge Harkins. Good man. Quiet." "Tomorrow?" Clara's head spun. "But I don't have a proper dress, and we should tell someone, and—" Elias stopped her protests with a gentle finger to her lips. His eyes asked the question, "Do you trust me?" "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I trust you." They spent the evening in a strange state of suspension, aware that everything was about to change. Elias was tender with her, helping her take down her hair, kissing her temple as she prepared their simple dinner. But there was restraint too, both of them aware of the line they hadn't yet crossed. Wouldn't cross until vows were spoken. That night, as they lay in their now familiar embrace, Clara whispered into the darkness, "Are you sure? I know this isn't what you planned. Taking on your brother's intended—" Elias's arms tightened around her. She felt him struggle, felt the words fighting to escape. Finally, he managed, "Mine, meant be mine." Clara turned in his arms to kiss him softly. "Yours," she agreed. "From the moment you couldn't leave me at that stage depot, maybe even before, in some way we don't understand." He buried his face in her hair, and she felt the wet warmth of tears, his or hers. She couldn't tell. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions. There would be those who wouldn't understand, who would judge and gossip and condemn. But tonight, in their cabin hidden in the mountains, 2 souls who had found each other through loss and silence and impossible choices held tight to the promise of tomorrow. A tomorrow where Clara Whitmore would become Clara Gray, where missing women and mail-order bride scandals would fade before the simple truth of 2 people who chose each other against all odds. Outside, an owl called across the valley, its voice carrying on the night wind. Elias pressed a kiss to Clara's hair. His hand splayed possessively across her stomach. "Wife," he whispered, practicing the word. "Husband?" she whispered back, and felt him smile against her skin. The peddler's visit had brought danger to their door, but it had also brought clarity. They would face whatever came together, bound by law as they were already bound by heart. And if anyone asked about the missing mail-order bride, they would find only Clara Gray, properly married, completely in love, and exactly where she chose to be. The blizzard struck 3 days after their wedding, as if nature itself conspired to test their new bond. Clara had been Mrs. Gray for exactly 72 hours, Judge Harkins had performed the ceremony in his study with his wife and clerk as witnesses, asking no uncomfortable questions about how long they'd known each other or why the bride wore a simple calico dress instead of white. Now, as wind howled through the canyon like a living thing, Clara understood why Elias had spent the previous days in frantic preparation. He'd chopped enough wood to build a second cabin, stored extra water, secured every loose board. She'd thought him overly cautious, mountain men and their weather superstitions. She'd teased, kissing his furrowed brow. She wasn't teasing now. "How long will it last?" she asked, watching snow pile against the windows at an alarming rate. Elias held up 3 fingers, then shrugged. Maybe 3 days, maybe more. He'd been unusually quiet since the storm began, a different quality to his silence than she'd grown accustomed to. Watchful, worried. By the second day, Clara understood his concern. The temperature inside dropped despite the roaring fire. Ice formed on the inside of the windows. They moved everything essential near the hearth: food, water, blankets. Elias strung a rope from the door to the woodpile after nearly losing his way in the whiteout conditions during one trip outside. "We have enough wood?" Clara asked, though she could see the worry in his eyes. He nodded, but his jaw was tight. On his slate, he wrote, "If we're careful." Careful meant banking the fire lower than comfortable, huddling together under every blanket they owned, heating only enough food to sustain them. Clara had never known cold like this. It crept through the walls, the floor, seeming to freeze the very air in her lungs. On the 3rd night, the wind reached a pitch that sounded almost human in its fury. Clara lay pressed against Elias, feeling him tense with every gust that shook the cabin. Around midnight, they heard it, a crack like a gunshot, followed by a grinding sound. Elias was up instantly, grabbing the lantern. Through the window, they could see nothing but swirling white. But the sound came again, and this time Clara recognized it. Trees breaking under the weight of snow and wind. "The woodpile," she breathed. "If a tree fell across it, blocked access." Elias was already pulling on his coat. Clara grabbed his arm. "No, you can't go out in this." He pointed to the fire, then held up 2 fingers. 2 days of wood left inside, maybe less. His eyes asked her to understand. Without access to the woodpile, they'd freeze before the storm passed. "Then I'm coming with you." He shook his head vehemently, but Clara was already wrapping herself in layers. 2 can clear it faster than 1. Don't argue with your wife. Elias Gray. Something shifted in his expression at the word wife, wonder mixed with fear for her safety. But he recognized the stubborn set of her jaw and surrendered, helping her tie a rope around her waist. He tied the other end to himself, then secured the main line to the door handle. If they lost sight of each other, the rope would guide them back. Opening the door was like stepping into a frozen hell. Wind-driven snow hit Clara's face like tiny knives. She couldn't see more than a foot ahead. Elias's hand found hers, squeezing once before they bent into the storm. The journey to the woodpile, normally 20 steps, felt like miles. Clara's feet went numb almost immediately. Her lungs burned with each breath. Only Elias's steady presence beside her kept panic at bay. They found the tree by running into it, a massive pine fallen directly across their wood supply. Elias gestured for her to stay back while he assessed the damage. Through the howling wind, she heard him curse, actual words torn from his throat by frustration. Working together, they managed to shift some of the smaller branches, freeing access to part of the pile. Clara's hands, even in mittens, felt like clubs. She could barely grip the logs Elias passed to her. They worked by feel more than sight, the wind trying to tear them away with every movement. Clara lost track of time. Her world narrowed to the rhythm of reach. Grab, pass, stack. When Elias finally pulled her back toward the cabin, she realized she couldn't feel her feet at all. The rope guided them home, but the short distance felt infinite. They tumbled through the door in a shower of snow. Elias slammed it shut and immediately turned to Clara, his face stark with concern. Her lips were blue, her whole body shaking uncontrollably. He didn't hesitate, stripping off her wet outer clothes with efficient hands, wrapping her in blankets, carrying her to the fire. Cold, she managed through chattering teeth. Elias built the fire higher, using more wood than was wise. He heated water, made her drink it even when she protested. Then he did something that would have scandalized proper society. He stripped off his own wet clothes and climbed under the blankets with her, skin to skin, sharing his body heat without hesitation or impropriety. Clara was too cold to feel embarrassed. She pressed against him, seeking warmth, feeling like she might never be warm again. Elias rubbed her back, her arms, trying to restore circulation. His own skin was cold, but warmer than hers. Gradually, painfully, feeling returned. With it came exhaustion so profound she could barely keep her eyes open, but also something else, a deep, bone-level awareness of the man holding her, her husband, who'd risked the storm beside her, who now gave his warmth without reservation. "Elias," she whispered against his chest. He pulled back enough to see her face, one hand coming up to check her temperature. His eyes held questions. "I'm warm now," she said softly. "Thanks to you." His relief was palpable. He pressed his forehead to hers, and she felt him shudder, not from cold, but from the release of fear. When he kissed her, it was different than before, desperate, claiming, a man who'd almost lost something precious and needed to affirm it still existed. Clara responded with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his hair. The storm ceased to exist, the cold, the danger, the world beyond their blanket cocoon, all of it faded before the heat building between them. When Elias pulled back, his eyes were dark with want, but also question. They'd been married 3 days, but hadn't yet. The wedding night had been spent holding each other, both too overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd done. The night since had been tender but chaste, as if they needed time to adjust to being husband and wife. But now, having faced death together in the storm, having stripped away everything but skin and need and the essential truth of their connection, Clara found herself impatient with waiting. "Yes," she whispered, answering his unspoken question. "Please, yes." What followed was a conversation without words, conducted in touches and sighs and the slide of skin against skin. Elias worshipped her with his hands, his mouth making up for his silence with a thoroughness that left Clara gasping. When they joined at last, it was with a rightness that brought tears to her eyes. This was what she'd traveled 3,000 miles to find, though she'd never known it. They moved together in ancient rhythm, the storm outside echoing the storm within. Clara heard sounds torn from Elias's throat, not words, but something more primitive, more honest. Her own voice rose to meet his, shameless in their isolation. When release claimed them, Clara felt Elias shudder against her, his face buried in her neck. She held him tightly, feeling the dampness of tears. His or hers, she couldn't tell. They stayed joined, neither willing to break the connection, as their breathing slowly calmed. Later, as they lay entwined, the fire painting golden patterns on their skin. Clara traced patterns on Elias's chest. "We almost died today," she said quietly. He nodded, his hand stroking her hair. Then, with obvious effort, "Worth it, you, worth everything. No more heroics without me," Clara said firmly. "We're partners now, in everything." He smiled, a real smile that transformed his weathered face. On a ring finger, the simple gold band he'd placed there 3 days ago caught the firelight. It had been his mother's. He'd managed to explain, kept safe all these years for the woman he'd choose. The storm raged for 2 more days. They rationed wood carefully, lived on simple meals, found ways to pass the time that required no words at all. When it finally broke, revealing a world transformed by white, they emerged from their cabin changed as well. The crisis had forged them into something stronger than either could be alone. Clara Gray Nee Whitmore had found her place in this harsh land, beside a man who spoke love in actions rather than words. And Elias had found his voice, not in speech, but in the certainty that he would face any storm, any danger, with this woman beside him. as they worked together to dig out from the blizzard's aftermath. Clara caught him watching her with that expression she'd come to treasure, wonder mixed with possession, mixed with a love too deep for words. "What?" she asked, pausing in her shoveling. He set aside his own shovel and came to her, cupping her face in his cold hands. With tremendous effort, he managed, "My wild mountain wife." Clara laughed, the sound bright against the snow. "You're frozen, tired, completely in love, wife," she corrected. He kissed her there in the snow, while the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. And if any questioned the mail-order bride who'd vanished into the mountains, they'd find only Clara Gray, properly married, thoroughly compromised, and utterly content, in the shelter of her husband's silent love. Spring came to the mountains like a cautious visitor, melting snow revealing the green promises beneath. Clara stood in her expanded garden, hands deep in the dark soil, planting the seeds that would feed them through another winter. But this year was different. This year, she was planting as Elias Gray's wife, as a woman who belonged to this land as surely as the pines and the stone. The transformation of their homestead mirrored the transformation of their marriage. Elias had built a chicken coop that actually kept foxes out, expanded the cabin with a proper bedroom, even started work on a small barn. Clara had made curtains for every window, braided rugs for the floors, and coaxed vegetables from soil everyone said was too rocky to grow anything. She was checking the new fence around her garden when she heard horses approaching, multiple horses, which was unusual. Elias was up at the north pasture. They'd acquired 3 cows over the winter, traded for pelts he'd trapped. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and moved toward the cabin, wishing Elias were closer. 3 riders appeared through the trees, 2 men in town clothes, looking uncomfortable on horseback, and Sheriff Palmer, whom Clara recognized from their wedding day at Judge Harkins's office. Her heart began to pound. "Mrs. Gray." The sheriff touched his hat. "These gentlemen need a word with you." The older of the 2 strangers dismounted stiffly. "Mrs. Gray, is it? I'm Marcus Thornton, attorney at law from Sacramento. This is Mr. Davies from the Territorial Census Board. We're investigating the matter of one Miss Clara Whitmore, who disappeared en route to marry Mr. James Whitlock last year." Clara forced herself to remain calm. "I see. How can I help you, gentlemen?" Thornton's eyes narrowed. "You can start by explaining why you match the description of Miss Whitmore exactly. Many women have brown hair and blue eyes. Mr. Thornton, perhaps, but how many of them are from Boston, arrived in Nevada Territory last spring, and are currently living on property adjacent to the late James Whitlock's land?" Clara felt the trap closing but kept her voice steady. "I don't know what you're implying, sir." "I'm not implying anything, madam. I'm stating facts. You are Clara Whitmore, are you not? The woman who agreed to marry James Whitlock, who disappeared between the stage depot and town." Thornton pulled out a telegram. "We've been in communication with the matrimonial agency. They're quite concerned about your welfare." Before Clara could respond, she heard a horse approaching fast. Elias appeared, rifle across his saddle, face dark as a thundercloud. He dismounted in one fluid motion, positioning himself between Clara and the visitors. "Mr. Gray," Sheriff Palmer said carefully, "these men are just asking questions." Elias's hand moved to his hip, where Clara knew he kept a knife. The threat was subtle but clear. "Now, see here," Davies blustered. "We represent the law. Do you?" Clara stepped around Elias, placing a calming hand on his arm. "What law, exactly?" "The law that says a woman can't choose where she lives, who she marries." Thornton consulted his papers. "The agency claims you entered into a binding agreement." "To marry a dead man?" Clara's voice rose. "James Whitlock was dead before I arrived." "Was I supposed to marry his grave?" "You were supposed to return east, or at least make your situation known. Instead, you vanished. Your cousin in Boston." "I have no cousin in Boston. I have no family anywhere, which I made clear in my correspondence with James." Clara felt Elias tense beside her. Someone is lying to you. Mr. Thornton. The attorney faltered slightly. Nevertheless, questions have been raised about whether you're here of your own free will. This man, he gestured at Elias. Is he holding you against your wishes? Clara laughed, surprising everyone, including herself. Look around you, Mr. Thornton. Do you see chains, locks, guards? I could leave any time I wished. I choose to stay. But why? Davies demanded. Why stay in this wilderness with a man who, forgive me, who cannot even speak? When you could return to civilization, the agency would place you with another suitable... He stopped abruptly as Elias stepped forward. Clara had never seen her husband truly angry before. His silence had weight, presence, danger. Even Sheriff Palmer's hand drifted toward his gun. Elias, Clara said softly. When he looked at her, she smiled. It's all right. They need to understand. She turned back to the visitors. You want to know why I stayed? Because when I stepped off that stage, alone and terrified, this man couldn't bear to leave me standing there. Because he carried me through a blizzard when fever nearly killed me. Because he speaks louder with his actions than most men do with 1,000 words. Her voice grew stronger. Because he sees me, not as a mail-order convenience, not as property to be traded, but as myself. Clara, just Clara. And that's enough for him. That's all very touching, Thornton said dryly. But it doesn't address the legal concerns. We're married. Clara interrupted. Judge Harkins performed the ceremony. Check the records if you doubt it. I am legally Mrs. Elias Gray, and unless you have evidence of a crime, I'll thank you to get off our property. Thornton and Davies exchanged glances. We'll need to verify this marriage, the attorney said finally. And we'll want to speak with you privately, to ensure... No. Elias's voice, rarely used, cut through the afternoon air like a blade. All three visitors startled. Sheriff Palmer cleared his throat. The man said no, gentlemen, and I can vouch for the marriage. I witnessed it myself. Seemed eager enough to me, both of them. But, Davies spluttered, I think we're done here. The sheriff said firmly, Mrs. Gray has answered your questions. She's clearly here by choice, legally married, and from what I can see, thriving, unless you have evidence of wrongdoing beyond gossip and speculation. Thornton's jaw worked. The agency is still owed compensation for their services. Clara went into the cabin and returned with a small purse. She counted out coins, most of their savings. Here, $20. That was the fee quoted in their advertisement. Tell them Clara Whitmore is dead. She died the moment she chose to become Clara Gray. The attorney took the money reluctantly. As the men prepared to leave, Davies couldn't resist one last jab. You could have done better than a mute savage. Miss Whitmore. The crack of Clara's palm against his cheek echoed off the mountain walls. Davies reeled back, hand to his face, as Elias stepped forward with murder in his eyes. His name, Clara said with deadly calm, is Elias Gray. He is my husband, and if you ever speak of him that way again, I'll show you just how savage a Boston seamstress can be. Sheriff Palmer actually smiled. Come on, gentlemen, time to go. And Davies, I'd keep that opinion to yourself in town. Folks here respect Elias Gray. Man saved the Hendricks boy from drowning last summer. Helped rebuild the church after the fire. We don't take kindly to outsiders insulting our own. As the three men rode away, Clara felt her knees go weak. Elias caught her, pulling her against him, his arms trembling with suppressed violence. It's over, she whispered. They're gone. We're safe. He pulled back to look at her face, one hand coming up to touch her cheek. Brave, he managed. My brave wife. I won't let anyone take me from you, not lawyers, not agencies, not God himself. Elias made a sound, half laugh, half sob, and kissed her hard. When they broke apart, he glanced toward the road where dust still lingered from the departing horses. His expression asked the question. They won't be back, Clara said with more confidence than she felt. And if they do, we'll face them together, like we always do. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Clara noticed Elias was unusually restless. He kept starting to write something on his slate, then erasing it. Finally, she took it from him. "What's troubling you?" He pointed to her, then to the road, then made a leaving gesture. Clara's heart sank. "You think I'll go? After everything?" He shook his head quickly, then struggled with words. "Finally," he managed. "Deserve better. Deserve normal." Clara set aside the slate and climbed into his lap, framing his face with her hands. "Listen to me, Elias Gray. I don't want normal. I want morning coffee with a man who remembers exactly how I take it. I want evenings by the fire with your arms around me. I want to wake up and know that every choice I make is mine, that every day I stay is because I choose to." She kissed him softly. "I want you. Silent, stubborn, wonderful you. Is that clear enough?" His answer was in his kiss, in the way he held her as if she were precious and unbreakable, and his later. As they prepared for bed in their cozy cabin, their home, Clara reflected on the day's confrontation. Clara Whitmore truly was dead, she realized. That frightened girl from Boston who'd thought love came in pretty letters and promises. In her place stood Clara Gray, mountain woman, gardener, wife to a man whose love ran deeper than words could ever express. As Elias pulled her close in their bed, his hand splaying possessively over her stomach, Clara smiled in the darkness. Let the outside world gossip. Let lawyers and agencies question. Here in their hidden valley, protected by mountains and silence and the fierce love of a man who spoke with his heart, Clara Gray had found something worth more than all the pretty words in the world. She'd found home. The pain started at dawn, pulling Clara from sleep with their intensity. She'd been expecting them for days now, her body heavy and awkward with the weight of new life. But Elias had gone to town for supplies, promising to return by nightfall. He'd been reluctant to leave, his eyes dark with worry, but they needed provisions for the coming weeks. Clara gripped the bedpost as another wave crashed over her. Too soon. The baby wasn't due for another month. Or so, Doctor Holloway had estimated during her last visit. But babies, Clara was learning, kept their own time. She managed to build up the fire and put water on to boil, habits ingrained from months of mountain living. Between contractions, she laid out clean cloths, found the knife Elias kept sharp for emergencies. Her mother had birthed 7 children, losing 3. Clara had helped with the last 2 before typhoid took her mother too. She knew what was coming. Another pain, stronger than before. Clara couldn't suppress a cry. Outside, their horses whinnied nervously. Sensing distress, she thought of Elias, probably just starting his journey home, unaware that his child had chosen this day to arrive. The hours blurred together in a haze of pain and determination. Clara had helped birth calves, assisted neighbor women in Boston's tenements, but experiencing it herself was different. Alone in their cabin, with only the wind for company, she felt both powerful and terrified. When the urge to push came, she gave in to instinct. Some part of her marveled at her own strength, at what the body could endure. She thought of all the women who'd done this before her, pioneer women birthing babies in wagons and sod houses, with no one but God as midwife. The baby's first cry coincided with the sound of hoofbeats. Elias, riding hard. Clara had just enough strength to wrap their daughter in clean cloth before the door burst open. Elias took in the scene. Clara on their bed, hair damp with sweat, holding a squalling bundle, and dropped everything he was carrying. "Margaret," Clara whispered, naming their daughter for Elias's mother. She couldn't wait. Elias crossed to them in 2 strides, falling to his knees beside the bed. His hands shook as he reached for them both, tears streaming down his weathered face. When he touched his daughter's tiny fist, she grasped his finger with surprising strength. "Papa's girl," he managed, voice rough with emotion. The next days passed in a blur of adjustment. Margaret, Maggie, as Clara began calling her, was small but fierce, with lungs that could wake the dead and her father's dark eyes. Elias transformed into something Clara had never seen, a man besotted. He held Maggie for hours, walking her around the cabin when she fussed, changing her with careful hands that had known only rough work. "Doctor." Holloway came to check on them, pronouncing both mother and child healthy despite the dramatic arrival. "Mountain babies," she said with approval. "They're made of tougher stuff." As Clara recovered, she watched Elias with their daughter and felt her heart might burst. He'd found new words for her. Beautiful. Strong. Miracle. Each one hard-won, but offered freely. At night, he'd place Maggie carefully between them, one large hand protective on her tiny back. One evening, as autumn painted the mountains gold, Clara sat on the porch nursing Maggie while Elias repaired a harness nearby. The domesticity of it struck her. How far they'd come from that first night when she'd arrived expecting one life and found another entirely. "I need to write to Boston," she said suddenly. "Let them know about all of this." Elias looked up, question in his eyes. "Not because I miss it," Clara assured him, "but because someone should know our story, the real story, not the gossip about mail-order brides and mysterious disappearances." That night, while Maggie slept in the cradle Elias had carved, Clara penned a letter to Mrs. O'Brien, her former landlady, the only person in Boston who might remember her kindly. "Dear Mrs. O'Brien," she wrote, "I hope this letter finds you well. You'll be surprised to hear from me after all this time, but I wanted you to know that I am alive, well, and happier than I ever dreamed possible. You remember I left to marry a rancher in Nevada Territory. What I found instead was my true husband, a man named Elias Gray, who speaks little but loves deeply. We have a daughter now, Margaret, who has her father's eyes and my stubborn nature. Life here is hard but good. I grow vegetables in soil everyone said wouldn't yield. 10 chickens that lay golden eggs, and wake each morning to mountain air and my husband's quiet strength. He cannot speak much, an old wound that never healed, but he tells me he loves me in 1,000 ways that need no words. I think of Boston sometimes, of the girl I was sewing collars in that cold room. I'm grateful for her courage in leaving, in taking a chance on the unknown. Without her bravery, I never would have found this life, this love, this home. Give my regards to anyone who remembers me, but tell them Clara Whitmore is gone. Clara Gray lives now, and she is exactly where she belongs." She sealed the letter, knowing it might never reach its destination, knowing, too, that it didn't matter. The writing had been for her, a final goodbye to the life she'd left, a celebration of the one she'd chosen. Fall deepened into winter, and their cabin became a cocoon of warmth against the cold world outside. Maggie grew round and bright, babbling sounds that Elias swore were words. He'd sit with her for hours, showing her picture books, teaching her the names of things with infinite patience. One night, as snow began to fall, Clara found him in the rocking chair with Maggie on his chest, both asleep. A book of fairy tales lay open on his lap. He'd been reading to her in his halting way, sounding out words he'd probably never spoken aloud before. Clara's throat tightened with love so fierce it almost hurt. This was what she'd traveled 3,000 miles to find, though she'd never known it. Not the prosperous rancher from the letters, not the promise of security and status, but this, a man who battled his own brokenness daily to give their daughter words, who loved with actions louder than any declaration. She thought of James, buried on the hill, and felt a strange gratitude. His dreams had brought her here. His death had stranded her, and in that stranding, she'd found everything. Perhaps some part of him had known that his quiet, damaged brother needed someone who could see past the silence to the heart beneath. Maggie stirred, making soft sounds. Elias's eyes opened, immediately alert. When he saw Clara watching, something passed between them. Understanding, gratitude, love too deep for any language. He held out his free arm, inviting her into their circle. Clara went, settling against his side, her hand resting on Maggie's back beside his. Outside, snow erased the world, making everything clean and new. Inside, The fire crackled. Their daughter breathed soft baby breaths, and Elias pressed a kiss to Clara's temple. "Home," he whispered, the word encompassing everything: the cabin, the land, but mostly the three of them together. Home. Clara agreed, and knew that no mail-order bride had ever found a better destination than the one she discovered by accident, by choice, by the grace of a silent man who'd refused to leave her standing alone at a stage depot. In the morning, there would be chores, cows to milk, chickens to feed, paths to clear. Maggie would wake demanding attention, the endless cycle of infant needs. But for now, in the lamplight with snow falling soft outside, Clara Gray sat with her family, her strange, perfect, chosen family, and knew herself the richest woman in Nevada territory. She'd sought a husband and found a heart. She'd expected words and discovered a deeper language. She'd thought she was choosing adventure and learned she was choosing home, and in a cabin that had seen too much sorrow. 3 souls made a new story, one of healing, of hope, of love that needed no words because it spoke in every breath, every touch, every shared silence that said more than volumes could contain. The mail-order bride who'd disappeared had found herself at last, and her name was Clara Gray, wife, mother, and living proof that sometimes getting lost is the only way to be truly found. Thank you for joining me on this wild journey through the Nevada mountains. If you're listening to this tale of Clara and Elias, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below and let's connect across the miles, just as Clara connected across a continent to find her true home. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of love, adventure, and the untamed American frontier. What did you think of Clara's choice? Would you have stayed with the silent mountain man? Share your thoughts below. I read every comment and love hearing how these tales of the Old West touch your hearts.